Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 8, Bacon's Rebellion. Last time, we talked about the social and political structure of Virginia under Governor William Barkley in the middle of the 17th century. At the bottom of the social ladder, white indentured servitude was being replaced by black slavery, and social mobility was declining. At the top of the ladder, the old self-made elite was being replaced by a richer and more aristocratic one. As a result, the relative political openness that had characterized the previous few decades of the colony's history began to be choked off. Barkley hadn't called for new elections to the House of Burgesses since 1661. And in 1670, the Assembly passed a bill once again restricting the right to vote to just those men who owned land. This was in keeping with English norms, but it was a break from tradition in Virginia. Today, we're going to discuss Bacon's Rebellion, the biggest political crisis in the Chesapeake to date, and in part a culmination of some of the trends that we've been talking about. The decade and a half after the restoration of the monarchy was relatively uneventful in Virginia. During the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a Dutch fleet had sailed into the Chesapeake and sunk or captured a number of ships. This was the same war in which England captured New York, so we'll have more to say about it in the future. In 1667, a hurricane hit the area, and in the early 1670s, some disease wiped out half the cattle. During the Third Anglo-Dutch War, another naval assault was successfully repulsed by the Virginians. So, overall, nothing too terribly exciting by these standards of the day. Nevertheless, the colonists weren't particularly happy. Tobacco prices were low thanks to greater competition, and taxes had been creeping up. Prospects for upward mobility were deteriorating, and the poorer planters were going into debt. New legislation from London restricted their trade with the Dutch, and the growing elite domination I discussed last episode was becoming increasingly obvious. The wealthy controlled both the colonial and local governments, and were largely unaccountable to anyone else, especially at the local level. So it seemed that taxes were just flowing into the pockets of nefarious men who used the money for personal enrichment rather than public benefit. For instance, despite a lot of money being spent on building new forts, the colony's defenses were shoddy at best. Much of this simmering discontent came to be focused, fairly or not, on Governor William Barkley, now fast approaching his 70s. After all, he had been in charge for some 20 of the last 30 years, and that's a long time to maintain one's popularity. His economic policies aimed at diversification had failed, leaving the colony vulnerable to fluctuations in tobacco prices. And don't forget he hadn't called for an election since 1661, though that doesn't seem to have been a major grievance against him. But the governor resisted reforms. Perhaps he'd grown rigid in his old age, perhaps he felt overly secure, perhaps he simply thought that reforms were a bad idea. Increasingly sick, tired and irritable, and growing deaf, he asked for permission to retire multiple times, but London ignored his requests. Regardless, discontent was growing in Virginia, and as it turned out, it didn't take much to set the colony off. The spark of Bacon's Rebellion was yet another breakdown in relations with the Native Americans. The Indians hadn't been much of a concern for the settlers since the last Anglo-Powhatan War back in the 1640s, which we discussed back in Episode 5. That war had ended with yet another defeat for the Native Americans. Their lands had been further reduced and they were forced onto what was essentially a reservation. Small forts were built along the edges of English territory, and attempts to Christianize the Indians and teach them the English way of life were mostly abandoned. But despite the efforts of the government to hold to the terms of the peace, settlers kept encroaching on native lands and provoking hostilities. Small-scale violence was common, but it was kept in check. The Virginians were constantly pressing the governor to allow them to use force against the Indians, but Barkley generally demurred. His main goal was to avoid anything that might lead to violence on the scale of the massacres in the 1620s and 1640s. But his caution did nothing to endear him to his countrymen. As the English spread further up the rivers of the Chesapeake, they came into contact with tribes other than the Powhatan. In particular, the further expansion of settlements in Maryland had forced the relocation of the Susquehannock tribe further south, towards the border with Virginia. There, along with the Doeg tribe, which already inhabited the Potomac, they proved to be disruptive to the settlers. In 1675, militiamen from Virginia and Maryland teamed up to force the Susquehannocks further upriver, but they failed. The Indians, who were now basically homeless, then took to raiding. They attacked and burned vulnerable outlying plantations, killing several dozen colonists in the process. The settlers now wanted blood, but Governor Barkley decided to pursue a possible peace agreement before using force. But no such peace agreement was possible. The Susquehannock had broken into smaller bands, and there was no one with any authority to negotiate with. So the raiding continued further and further towards the heart of English territory around Jamestown. And despite the strong wishes of the settlers, there was no real pushback from the government. To them, Barclay seemed more and more weak and out of touch. They were just about ready to take matters into their own hands. Enter Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon was the, quote, spoiled child of a wealthy English squire, in the words of one historian. He was also, incidentally, a distant relative of Francis Bacon, who had been one of the first philosophers to describe the scientific method. Nathaniel Bacon had been all set to lead a comfortable and easy life, as was fitting for someone of his status. But his wife was unexpectedly disinherited, and he then became involved in some scheme to defraud someone else of their inheritance. As a result of the scandal, Bacon's family sent him and his wife to live in Virginia. He arrived in 1674 with £1,800, a very large sum of money. He already had a relative in the colony who had risen to join the council. The elder Bacon helped the younger one join Virginia's elite. Very quickly, the younger Bacon was himself made a member of the council, although he rarely attended meetings. He was hot-headed, prickly, and young, only 27 when he arrived in the colony. Charismatic, but clearly lacking in foresight based on the evidence, of which there is relatively little. Certainly nothing in his life suggests that he was a thoughtful or responsible leader. He had been in the colony 2 years when the trouble with the Susquehannock began. Bacon's new plantation was up the James River, not totally on the frontier, but still vulnerable to attack. In early 1676, the overseer of Bacon's plantation was killed by the Indians. As I said, the men of the region wanted action, and they started assembling a militia on their own. But they lacked leadership, and so they turned to Bacon, a new arrival but already an influential man, with friends in high places. And he was certainly hostile to the Indians. Fatefully, he agreed to lead them. This was against the direct instructions of the governor, who still wished to avoid further escalation. Bacon was swiftly declared a rebel by Barclay, but he refused to stand down, even with an offer of total clemency. Instead, he led his men into Indian territory to take on whichever tribes they found, never mind whether they had been the ones responsible for all the raiding. Barclay finally sensed that his position and the stability of Virginia were in danger. He removed Bacon from his position on the council and promised to declare war on the Indians, but under his authority. He called for new elections to the House of Burgesses, the first in 15 years. All of these moves were in part to isolate Bacon politically, and to keep the colonists satisfied enough to avoid any further insubordination. But as it turned out, Bacon's raid was a resounding success, and his popularity in the colony was increasing rapidly. He had been stripped of his position on the council, but he won election as a burgess. He held off on taking his seat, however, for fear of arrest. So the General Assembly soon convened without him. This new assembly would later be remembered for being rather populist, but that wasn't entirely the case. Most of the members had been burgesses before, so there hadn't been some big pro-Bacon upheaval. There was a lot of new legislation, but in part that was just the assembly using the crisis to implement reforms that they had been planning on passing anyway. But there were some measures to placate the masses. Tax exemptions for the powerful were curbed and abuses of office were checked. A general amnesty was declared for Bacon's militia as well. And there were some moderately democratic reforms to the electoral system. A few years back, the assembly had once again passed a law restricting the vote to, quote, freeholders and housekeepers. Basically, this cut out a lot of freemen who didn't own land. They had tried to do something similar in the 1650s, but failed in the face of popular discontent. I discussed this 2 episodes ago. Well, they tried it again. This time, the justification was that freemen, quote, having little interest in the country, do oftener make tumults at the election to the disturbance of His Majesty's peace, than by their discretions in their votes provide for the conservation thereof, by making choice of persons fitly qualified for so great a trust. The freemen, not owning land, could move around and so had no reason to invest in local government. They just caused a ruckus. Or so the Assembly said. This act was quickly reversed in the newly elected 1676 Assembly. The right to vote was restored to all freemen. They also made provision for elections to be held for positions in the county courts to monitor the collection of taxes, for the first time bringing a bit of representation to local government. While the Assembly was doing its work, Bacon finally returned to Jamestown to see what his reception would be. Not good, as it turned out. Barclay had his men fire on Bacon's approaching ship. He got away, but was captured the next day regardless, and he was taken as a prisoner before the governor, who proclaimed him, quote, the greatest rebel that ever was in Virginia. But as was so often the case, Barclay wasn't looking to punish the rebel, just bring him back into line. He could sense the populist anger that Bacon was tapping into, so it was much better to get Bacon to willingly submit to the government. Therefore, Bacon was swiftly paroled. 2 days later, he was before the governor again, confessing his guilt and pleading for clemency, to which Berkeley readily agreed. He was restored to his position on the council, and he never actually sat with the Burgesses. But something between the two went awry. What exactly happened is uncertain, but it seems that after his release, Bacon had been expecting a commission to lead another force against the Indians. But for whatever reason, a change of heart perhaps, Berkeley refused to give the young upstart another command. So Bacon sulked back home. When he got out of Jamestown, he found that the people were anxious to fight under him, and angry when they learned that he hadn't been given a commission. Apparently sensing that the tide of public opinion was very much with him, Bacon marched back to Jamestown, this time at the head of a 500-man militia, to make his demands. He was met by a furious Berkeley. The old governor bared his chest and dared Bacon to shoot him. He then drew his sword and challenged Bacon, 40-plus years his junior, to settle the matter man to man. But Bacon would not be deterred, crying, "God damn my blood, I came for a commission, and a commission I will have before I go." He then ordered his men to aim their guns at the State House and at the Burgesses who were watching in shock. That was enough to break the governor's resolve for the moment. He gave in, and Bacon got his commission. But while Bacon's earlier indiscretions could easily be forgiven, surely William Claiborne had been far more insubordinate. This most certainly could not. Launching an unauthorized war against the Indians was one thing. Threatening to fire on government officials, quite another. He had been given his command, but it was only as a ruse. As soon as possible, Governor Berkeley began raising his own force to go out and meet Bacon, who was again declared a rebel. But Berkeley had miscalculated. He wasn't popular enough in the colony to raise a force quickly enough, and he hadn't given Bacon enough time to get far enough away from the capital. So when Bacon heard that the governor was raising a force against him, he turned his army back around towards Jamestown, and Berkeley had no choice but to flee to the coast. There he sent word of the rebellion to England, asking for aid and again requesting to be relieved of his position. With Jamestown, and indeed most of Virginia, now in his hands, Bacon tried to consolidate his position, swearing all his men to an oath of loyalty and forcing some captive councilors to call for the election of a new assembly. Bacon had backed himself into a dangerous position through his intemperance. It was going to be very hard for him to avoid hanging for treason at this point, and he was casting about for any legal justification he could find. But in the end, it didn't matter. Bacon marched again against the Native Americans, this time with more mixed success. He only found some women, children, and old men to kill and enslave. While he was out in the field, Berkeley sailed back to Jamestown and reoccupied it. Now facing a war on two fronts, Bacon had no choice but to once again return to the capital. In September he retook the town with a force of a few hundred men, but rather than risk losing it to the governor's forces, they simply burned the city to the ground. But it was all for nothing. Exhausted by the struggle, Nathaniel Bacon died from dysentery the next month. Without his leadership, the rebellion swiftly and completely collapsed. The whole affair had lasted only a few months. Governor Berkeley moved quickly to reinforce his authority. The remaining rebels were hunted down and a full 24 were hanged. He was being far more harsh than was normal, refusing to grant clemency and putting down his enemies as fiercely as he could. Apocryphally, when King Charles heard about his conduct, he said, quote, "That old fool has put to death more people in that naked country than I did here, for the murder of my father." The last rebels to be captured, incidentally, were a group of 80 slaves and 20 white servants who had banded together. When a fleet arrived from England that January to help him subdue the colony, the 1,000 troops that had been sent found that they had nothing to do. The war had been won. Even relations with the Indians were calm again. But in addition to the useless soldiers, the fleet also had on board Governor Berkeley's replacement. You'd think being relieved of duty would be a relief, but actually he was being called back to England in disgrace, to answer for having let the rebellion get so out of hand. So Berkeley remained in Virginia for a little while longer, dragging his feet and staying in power to oversee the transition. The commission that arrived in Virginia also carried with it instructions from the king, which significantly weakened the powers of the General Assembly. From now on, assemblies were to be held every 2 years rather than annually, and its sessions were shortened from 3 weeks to 2. The Burgesses lost the ability to set their own salaries, and the king reinforced his ability to veto the assembly's legislation. Plus, the king confirmed that from now on, only freeholders would be allowed to vote rather than all freemen. Clearly, Charles was looking to suppress the uniquely popular aspects of Virginian government. A new, even more compliant General Assembly was elected. Most of the legislation that had been passed by the previous assembly was repealed in full. And of course, none of the electoral reforms were brought back. There would now be property requirements for voting through the rest of the colonial period. The attempt at adding elected officials to some parts of local government was repealed as well, though it had never gone into effect. Overall, Virginian self-government was being substantially curtailed. So, finally, with his business done, Berkeley sailed away for England. He would never see Virginia again. That June, he died suddenly in London at the age of about 71. He had lived in and governed Virginia for most of the last 35 years. It was a rather pathetic end to a career that had for the most part gone well. He had successfully negotiated a generous surrender to the parliamentarians and successfully brought Virginia back into the royal fold. Under his rule, the population of the colony had quintupled, and he had been an important figure in the colonization of North and South Carolina, which I'll discuss in the future. He had failed in a number of his aims, though, most especially to diversify Virginia's economy, and the social changes that began under his rule did much to undermine the representative nature of Virginia's government, in a way that would resonate clear through to the Civil Rights Movement some 300 years later. And his mishandling of Bacon's rebellion gave the Crown a freer hand in interfering in Virginia politics. In the end, I think that economics and cultural momentum mattered more than the man. Virginia would have become a racially divided slave society with or without him. He merely accepted the changes, he didn't invite them. So rest in peace, Governor Sir William Berkeley, the first of Virginia's aristocrats. There's one more figure we have to bid farewell to before we wrap up the early Chesapeake. Cecil Calvert, the 2nd Baron Baltimore. Lord Baltimore died on the 30th of November, 1675, just 7 months before William Berkeley. He was 70 and he'd been Lord Proprietor of Maryland for some 43 years. In all that time, he had never once set foot in the colony. He had wanted to go, but the turmoil in England meant that he was forced to remain to defend his charter to the colony again and again. But he had succeeded. Maryland was still in the hands of the Calvert family. That was his legacy more than anything else, just holding on. The proprietorship passed to his son, Charles Calvert, the 3rd Baron Baltimore. Charles was actually in Maryland when his father passed, and he remained in the colony for a few more years, so he was around to steer Maryland through the threat posed by Bacon's rebellion. Maryland had been watching the unrest in Virginia with unease. After all, the two colonies were intimately connected, and the unrest in Virginia had begun with events in Maryland. And remember that, just as in Virginia, Maryland had restricted the right to vote to landholders in 1670. So conditions were similar enough for concern. But in the end, the disruption to Maryland was minimal. There was discontent, but it never coalesced into anything substantial. The biggest event was the Davies Pate uprising, in which a few dozen men met to protest a few issues, such as taxation, re-expanding the right to vote, and altering the oath to the Lord Proprietor that they had to swear. It was a small affair, no real threat, but the two leaders were promptly hanged anyway. The new Lord Baltimore had been in the colony as governor since 1661, and his on-site experience served him well, but in 1684 he was forced to depart the colony for business in England, and he would never return. Neither Cecil nor Charles were able to come up with a workable political solution for Maryland. The son would prove to be just as unbending with regards to his rights as proprietor as his father. Things will fall apart once again in the colony, but we won't be getting back to that for a good while. But clearly, distant, absolute rule by a Catholic overlord was just unsustainable in the long run. On the other hand, Virginia didn't have any of those concerns, and yet it broke out into a much larger rebellion than anything in Maryland. Bacon and his followers weren't aiming to reshape the fundamental political settlement of Virginia, so what was Bacon's rebellion about, really? There's no real consensus among historians, but I'll offer a few thoughts. We can look at the various statements that Bacon himself put out, detailing the grievances of the colonists. In one document, the Declaration of the People of Virginia, 5 of the 8 complaints are about government policy towards the Indians. 2 of the complaints are about corruption and abuses of office. 1 is about high taxation. In another letter sent to England to justify his revolt, Bacon explicitly cites the fact that the rich men of the colony have conspired to seize political power for themselves. He says that, quote, "The poverty of the country is such that all the power and sway has got into the hands of the rich, who by extortionate advantages, having the common people in their debt, have always curbed and oppressed them in all manner of ways." He also references the fact that propertyless freemen are disbarred from voting as evidence of this. As a result, the government of Virginia could no longer be trusted to represent the people, thus justifying Bacon's rebellion as a regrettable necessity. According to Bacon, of course. In the 1700s, he would gain a reputation as a freedom fighter and an early precursor of the American Revolution. To me personally, he seems like a man simply driven by events and capitalizing on the grievances of others to suit his short-term needs, but that's ultimately just a guess on my part. And in any case, whatever Bacon's motives were, the motives of the men who fought under him were no doubt very real. Unlike in Maryland, the concerns in Virginia were more about specific policies, using greater force against the Indians, lowering taxes. There were concerns related to the colony's long-term trajectory towards greater economic and social inequality, but the colonists weren't looking for long-term solutions, just immediate redress for their grievances. Bacon's rebellion wasn't exactly a populist uprising, whatever that is, at least not fully. Nor was it especially radical. In no small part, it was simply an accident, an unintentional escalation between a hot-headed young man with too little sense and an old man with too little flexibility. Greater leadership from either Bacon or Berkeley probably could have headed the whole thing off. There were grievances in the colony, but things were hardly intolerable. A war against the Indians, some minor government reform, and maybe some lower taxes would have been more than enough to stave off rebellion. But the rebellion did happen. Jamestown was a burned-out ruin. Dozens were dead, English troops were in Virginia, royal authority was being asserted at the expense of representative self-rule. To the people of the Chesapeake, it must have been a frightening and uncertain time. Who knew what the future would bring? Who knew what their society would become? So there it is, the first 7 years of English colonization in the Chesapeake. We've come a long way from the horrors and deprivations of those first years at Jamestown, haven't we? I think that Bacon's rebellion makes a good stopping point for this part of our story, a good cliffhanger. Next time I'll begin a new series of episodes on New England, starting with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower in 1620 all the way through to King Philip's War, a massive uprising by the Indians, which was happening at the same time as Bacon's rebellion. We'll see how different economic conditions and a different culture led to a quite different political system up there. But before I wrap up the Chesapeake, I'd like to close with a summary of how elections in both Maryland and Virginia have developed and why they did so. This is, after all, supposed to be the history of elections in America, and I worry about losing sight of that in these early years, when neither the House of Burgesses nor Maryland's lower house were tremendously important. The first elections in Virginia in 1606, the ones I talked about all the way back in episode 1, weren't real elections at all, not in any modern sense. These were the elections for president of the colony from among the councilmen appointed by the Virginia Company. There was nothing even remotely democratic about them, nothing that connected them to the future of the history of elections in America. Those elections were simply a failed corporate scheme to give the leaders of the colony some flexibility in response to conditions on site. But the scheme did fail miserably. There was no way that the first years of settlement at Jamestown were going to be easy, but at least some disasters could have been avoided. So the system of rule by the council was swiftly discarded and replaced by one of basically martial law, led by governors with near absolute power appointed in England. This new approach was at least relatively more successful, but it was soon outgrown. What Virginia really needed was not political changes, but economic ones. Virginia needed to ditch its top-down model and replace it with one of independent farmers growing tobacco as a cash crop. That required enticing new settlers, and so a momentous political change was made as a byproduct of that need. In 1619, the Virginia Company granted its colony a partly elected legislature. The General Assembly was a bold move for the time, especially considering the fragile state of the colony. But it was a success, and along with other reforms, it encouraged ever more Englishmen to begin settling in the New World. And the elections of burgesses to the Assembly would now be a permanent fixture of Virginian life. Well, sort of. As we've seen, there were two big challenges to the continuity of Virginian elections. The first was the dissolution of the Virginia Company in the 1620s and King Charles's neglect in reauthorizing the Assembly. The second was Governor Berkeley's decision to avoid calling elections for a decade and a half. Both of these actions disrupted the elections of burgesses for a period, but neither was enough to stop them altogether. Once the obstacle was removed, things went right back to the way they were before. And the Assembly survived several other crises, 2 devastating massacres plus the back-and-forth instability of the English Civil War, with even less disruption. The same was true in Maryland. After William Claiborne overthrew the government in the 1640s, Maryland's Assembly went right back to assembling. The various challenges to the proprietary rule of Lord Baltimore tried to use the Assembly for their own ends rather than dissolve it. In both Maryland and Virginia, the assemblies were too useful and too well-liked by the colonists to give up. I think that in the further development of the two legislatures you can see 2 main trends which somewhat counteract each other. The first trend is the increasing viability of self-rule. This occurred for several reasons. The first is that over time the Chesapeake's population grew enough for the colonies to have a stable pool of talent to draw from. There were enough local men who were capable enough to serve as sheriffs, burgesses, councilors, and so on. The second reason is the professionalization of the assemblies and the accumulation of experience. The legislators of the Chesapeake copied practices from the House of Commons, but then they developed institutional histories of their own. You can see this for yourself if you go through the acts of the assemblies over time. A bill in the 1630s might just be a short paragraph or two, but by the time you get to the early 1700s, bills can be several pages long, with language that is far more precise and lawyerly. They were learning. The third reason is the light hand with which England ruled its colonies. This wasn't a totally conscious choice. Often England was simply busy with its own affairs, and when things finally settled down, they became more active in their control. But the relative independence allowed Virginia's institutions to evolve into a stable form that matched the needs of Virginia society, which of course meant that the system was much harder to dislodge when the English did try to take a stronger hand. So that's the first trend, growing self-government. The second trend is the slow restriction of the right to vote. In both Maryland and Virginia, the trend from about the 1650s onward was to make voting more limited. Even as self-rule expanded, the number of those who could participate in that self-rule contracted. In fact, while the pool of voters started off high, it never actually expanded above that initial base in either colony. It only shrunk. Even at their most open, elections in the Chesapeake weren't very representative by modern standards, but even at their most restricted, they were pretty representative by the standards of the day. To have any sort of elected representative body at all was atypical. But it was never the case that a majority of people could vote. Obviously, women were excluded, though remember they were only like 20% of the population back then. More important were the limits on servants from voting. Servants were a majority of the colony's population, and they were mostly excluded right from the start, and explicitly excluded soon enough. Free blacks, too, wouldn't have been expected to vote, even in the decades before they were legally banned from doing so. As the population grew, so did social and economic stratification. The Chesapeake started to become a society, not just a fledgling colony. It came to more closely resemble early modern England, not just economically but politically. The English restrictions on the right to vote were explicitly cited as precedents in America, and because there was no ideological support for representative government as being good in and of itself, there was perhaps less pushback against these restrictions than you would get today. This very different attitude towards elections is one of the most striking discontinuities between then and now, in my opinion. It is interesting to note, though, that representative government preceded real philosophical debates in favor of representative government by a considerable margin. It was really only during and after the English Civil War that these ideas were expounded upon by men like John Locke, who we'll get to later. The process was much more organic than that. It was only slowly becoming the case that people were consciously thinking about government in terms of rights, toleration, and representation, ideas that they now had some practical experience in. So that was where things stood back then. From 1676 onward, Virginia entered yet another phase of its political history, one in which the powers of the burgesses were substantially reduced thanks to interference from the crown. London was finally becoming less passive in the running of its empire and was attempting to knit the colonies more firmly into a mercantilist system. That meant a greater need to interfere in the politics of Virginia and its other colonies going forward. And the Chesapeake was no longer so isolated, no longer just a tiny enclave of scattered farms separated from other European settlements by hundreds of miles. With the colonization of the Carolinas and the conquest of the New Netherlands in the 1660s, the English finally had control of the North American coast, all the way from New England down to Spanish Florida. The 13 colonies were slowly coming together. Next time on Early and Often, we'll begin the story of some more of those colonies, all the way back in 1620, with 104 pilgrims huddled together in the hold of a ship called the Mayflower. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter, at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode at the blog, earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.